that the sure way for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. So I felt compelled to do something. And so I've been on the school board now for almost 2 years. It is probably the most challenging job I've ever had in my life. And that we're trying to, as a conservative in the education blob, as John Stossel calls it, you are pretty much on your own. And fortunately, Kelly and I got together. But what I've done, because although finances consumes us, curriculum, what the kids are learning is of great concern to me, because I've had a lot of young engineers, young officers working for me, and I felt like they had missed something in their education. So I looked at and reviewed the current history book in use in our high school and for the U.S. history course, which is a 10th or 11th grade junior year course that everybody is required to take. And I also found out that it's the same book in use by the Springboro School District. So I put together, I had about 180 specific things I put into a spreadsheet, the things that were incorrect, misleading, or indoctrinational. Kelly asked me if I would please turn that into a little discussion today. I've taken what I think are some of the more important things out of it, and that's become today's presentation. For those of you who showed up a little bit late, I got a couple more copies of the presentation over here on the front table if you'd like to take them. And the last slide, by the way, is my bio, so if you're really curious as to whether I'm qualified to talk about anything, feel free to use that. So look at that. I want to start off by a disclaimer saying that I am speaking only for myself, and I don't speak for either our Board of Education or our school district. And to the best of my ability, in support of my judgments, I try to use the facts from original sources or more traditional sources than those found in the book, The Americans. The Americans, Reconstruction to the 21st Century, published by McDougall-Littell, Division of Houghton Mifflin, which is a big textbook publisher. It's copyrighted in 2007. And oh, by the way, you all know that U.S. history now only covers 1870 to the present. That means that prehistory that is taught in high school, or that means that the pre-1870 U.S. history is not very important in the eyes of today's education establishment. I think it is. And I quote George Washington, who said, "A primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, what species of knowledge can be equally important? And what duty more pressing than communicating it to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberties of our country?" Unquote. I believe that history is the basis upon which we can learn the science of government. And if you study history, you'll come to the conclusion that human nature not only is not perfectible, but it hasn't even changed in the last 5,000 years. My concern is over the decline in our society in terms of learning, morals, and character, which can be traced, I believe, to the rise of progressivism. President Obama was probably correct when he said we are not a Christian nation. We certainly were not informed that way, but sadly that's what we have become. Next slide, please. By the way, my wife, Carolyn, is flipping slides for me, and I thank her for showing up. And I want to also acknowledge and thank State Senator Joseph Uecker for coming today. He's my brother. I'm not going to read the slides for the most part. My belief is you all can do that. I'm going to tell you things. There's so much to say. I'm going to go through and tell you the story as I see it. I'm going to start off by saying that former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said, quote, "Less than 1/3 of 8th graders can identify the historical purpose of the Declaration of Independence." And it's right there in the name. The more I read and the more I listen, the more apparent it is that our society suffers from an alarming degree of public ignorance, unquote. Well, that's really good news for those who are wishing transformational change in America, since U.S. high school history doesn't even cover pre-1870 events. You've got to wonder how the other 2/3 of the people who didn't get it the first time ever learn about our founding fathers. our foundational documents, all of the history that brought us to a Constitution that is what we are today. In fact, it's easy to see that the ill-informed are more susceptible to emotional arguments. They're more likely to see life as a zero-sum game. They're more likely to believe that the prosperous becomes so only at someone else's expense. My belief is that this history book, and oh, by the way, I brought a copy of it just so you'll see. And if you look at it, you'll see it's got a lot more pictures and sidebars and other things that obviate the need to actually talk about facts, which I think is something we all ought to deal with at some point in time. In short, the radicals of the 1960s have written the textbooks of today. Next slide, please. Why is it what it is? Well, one of the things, and people talk about, what are we doing? What can you do to change the curriculum? Well, the curriculum is driven by the Ohio graduation test. Because if you only have a certain amount of time, and that time is decreasing because it's being absorbed by other, quote, mandates from the state and federal level, you sort of concentrate on teaching to the test because your district is going to be graded on how well it achieves good scores on that test. Well, as the progressive of the past, guy by the name of Vladimir Lenin once said, give us the child for 8 years and he'll be a Bolshevik forever. That's why the left has taken control of public education and been so since the 60s or even before. They want what they call the masses to be ignorant. By the way, if you go to the OSBA training session, they refer to our constituents as the masses. I found that insulting, by the way. They want the masses to be ignorant, dependent on the largesse of government in order to win their votes until the last election. That's my belief. The Americans, I believe, is dedicated to the proposition that the progressive role is to perfect a nation founded by rich white men so that from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. As a result, more emphasis is placed in this book on Harriet Tubman than on George Washington, or about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II than D-Day, Pearl Harbor, or Iwo Jima. More on the dangers we face from Joseph McCarthy than the dangers we might have faced or did face from Joseph Stalin. Too much of this book is sociology and proof by anecdote. Oh, by the way, there are no references, no footnotes in this history book, this so-called history book. But they use anecdotes, sidebars to make their points. There's no attempt to look at the long-term or mid-term effect of progressive policies. So all the progressive initiatives, from aggregation of power in D.C. to the Great Society to Hillary Care, are treated as wonderful goods with no downside, especially concerned for its constitutionality. Never a mention of the Communist International or the USSR as expansionist religions, which they are, both of which need to expand to keep from collapsing. Next slide, please, dear. The book has, and they state right up front in the introduction, that there are 9 themes that they wish to cover. These 9 themes are touted in the introduction as their talking points, and the authors then wrap U.S. history around these themes. This enables the writers to sort of jump around, moving back and forth through time, to point out how these 9 themes weave a story of striving by minorities and women to overcome the obstacles that the founders put in their way. Since their most popular device is the anecdote, the individual story, portray how an individual and by association the group was impacted by whatever was going on, be it the Depression, immigration laws, or civil rights. Now I'm going to go through each one of these themes one by one, which is about all the time I have, and try to describe the impacts on education of that. Now, since they are always talking about these 9 themes, and that you've chosen this way to portray history, the book jumps all around, back and forth, as it goes from one theme to the next. I love history. I majored in history. I found this book so poorly organized and written that I would be surprised if any student today would ever want to study history after having been subjected to this particular text. Next slide. First one, diversity and the national identity. In reality, the U.S. was not diverse in most respects until the 1840s. Indeed, pre-1840, Americans were white, Christian, and overwhelmingly Protestant. Indeed, in the Revolutionary War, 2/3 of the soldiers who fought for the states, for the colonies, were of Scots-Irish descent. There were more German language daily newspapers in 1930 than there are Hispanic papers today. But the media culture has changed. On the other hand, it's also true that German Americans signed up in much larger percentages to fight in World War I than did Arab and Muslim Americans after 9/11. Back then, it was viewed as a necessary means of showing one's loyalty to America. On a side note, I do have to acknowledge proudly that Hispanics now make up a higher percentage of soldiers in today's Army than any other group. When they talk about immigration, there's really only one or two mentions of the fact that immigrants that came here, they were looking for a better life. And that they were, by the second, third generation, overwhelmingly successful. Even the parents might have done menial work, 2 jobs, all the stuff, but sons and daughters received education and success. Consistent with the president's claim that all countries think they are exceptional, but none really are. Not exactly true. We really are exceptional, I think, and this book never really acknowledges that. In fact, they talk about diversity, but they really never talk about diversity of thought, i.e. they never talk about evolution versus creation or capitalism versus communism. They really never have a discussion on those two concepts. The reality is that English literacy is essential to success in today's world. So if you can't read and write in American English, you're in trouble no matter where you go. In fact, I've been a lot of different places around the world. English is the international language. So those of us who say we should teach English as only as a second language, if they really don't learn it, it's not a big deal. It's a huge deal. Not only in America, but anywhere in the world. Anyway. Next slide, please. America and world affairs. All right. If you don't think the book is one-sided, try to find out with this book where the student will learn that there were 17,000 U.S. troops in South Vietnam the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Kind of gloss over that. Oh, but they were almost all but about 400 or 500 of them were put there by John F. Kennedy after he came into office. On world affairs, the Teller Amendment, which was a result, came after the Spanish-American War, required the U.S. to leave Cuba. It was the first and one of the very only laws in history up to that point I've ever seen where the people of a victorious nation required their military to actually depart the conquered nation. Not in this book. There's no mention of the fact that the USSR was in active competition with us after World War II. No mention of the opposing political systems, the Soviet bloc. They do talk a little bit about the policy of containment, but they really don't talk to it in terms of the threat to our nation, to our civilization, to the free world of communist expansion. Now, there's serious evidence that President Reagan, Prime Minister Maggie Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II were working together and were instrumental in the defeat of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. It's too bad that that's never mentioned in this book. Next slide. It's interesting when they talk about World War II, of which they dedicate a whole 40 pages out of 900, that the first paragraph of the first chapter is an anti-war PTSD tale. Post-traumatic stress disorder. That's a term I didn't even know about until after I retired from the Air Force. And one page on Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's plan to conquer Russia, the Soviet Union, in World War II. They kind of mention it, but they miss the point. And the point is that there's a lot of evidence that if Hitler had gone in as a liberating army rather than as a conquering one, he might have freed Russia from communism. But he treated the Russians as slaves, whether they were soldiers or farmers or villagers. He overextended his logistics lines and did not properly equip his soldiers for what turned out to be a kind of a rough winter or two in the Asian continent. The book portrays Stalingrad's battle as one where Stalin won. What really kind of happened was that the German Wehrmacht lost. They were overextended, they were out of fuel, they were ill-equipped, the soldiers were cold and miserable and hungry, and they couldn't fight. And that's kind of the way wars go. There's an old saying amongst the old people who fought, is that amateurs speak of strategy, professionals speak of logistics. Hitler did not understand that. Logistics was important. In fact, there's no mention of the impact of Lend-Lease on Russia. Do you realize that most of the tanks that were used in the first couple of years of the war in Russia were built by either Americans or Britons, and that the frontline fighter for the Soviet Union back from 40 to 42 was the P-39 Aerocobra, an aircraft that was not used by our Air Corps because it wasn't good enough to be a frontline fighter. But that was the bet we gave them. We basically gave them that fighter, and that was what they used. We helped them avoid defeat. You know, of all those 40 pages, there's no mention of the air war. You know, 20-some-odd thousand U.S. airmen lost their lives or were captured in the air war over Europe. Not a mention. Never mentioned what the impact of the air war was, since they didn't talk about it. They never talk about the fact that the United States basically outproduced the world. They certainly never talk about the unintended consequences of government policies. Policies like wage and price controls. You ask why the government has gotten into medical care. It's because of wage controls in World War II. You say, how did that happen? Very, very quickly and very easily. They froze wages. What they didn't freeze was perks. And one of the perks was, aside from parking spots in corner offices, was free medical insurance. And over time, that became Obamacare. They talk at length about the internment of the Japanese. They never really talk about the fact that at the beginning of World War II, the FBI knew that there were Japanese spies. The problem was that they weren't well organized enough to know who they were. So I'm not sure. I don't agree with the policy, but the policy basically resulted in taking all of the Japanese off the street until they could get it sorted out. Probably a bad idea, but they never talk about why we did that. We didn't do it because we were racist. We were doing it that FDR, who might have been a racist, but that's not proof of it. Nonetheless, was trying to keep America from being infiltrated and fought from the inside. You have to ask yourself, why was it so important for this book to talk about at length about Hitler marrying Eva Braun? But they omitted the air war. There are a lot of interesting anecdotes in this book, but very little history of what happened, why, and what was the result. And in fact, if you read through it, you might come to the conclusion that we had little moral authority for what we did. In fact, there's an awful lot of discussion on whether the A-bomb should have been used or not, with a predominant feeling that we probably were wrong in doing that, despite overwhelming evidence. If you go and actually look at the subsequently released documents, that there was fear of 1 million U.S. casualties if we had to invade, and probably 2 to 3 times that number of Japanese casualties that would have been. And they never talk about the fact that more people died in the firebombing raids over Tokyo in March of 1945 than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. They never talk about that. The reason I know this was I went to the Air Force Academy, and as a history major, I got to actually read the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey of World War II. They never really talk about the disaster of Yalta or USSR's expansion this way. So please. Economic opportunity, let's turn, let's see, economic opportunity. They dwell an awful lot on the treatment of the Indians, and I won't say that it was good. In fact, I will argue that we treated them very badly. But there's no comparison to what other civilizations have done throughout history, and saying that this was not inconsistent with the nature of mankind. Whether you're talking about the Vikings, or the Visigoths, or the French, conquering countries tend to push out, or otherwise enslave the conquered. The book tends to portray the American Indians as the quintessential noble savage. They never really portray them as the nomadic, cruel people as they were. In fact, you have to ask a student, The Last of the Mohicans, you've heard of that book. What caused that person to be the last? It wasn't the white guys. If you want a tribe to pin it on, it's called the Hurons. So, let's say, there's no mention of the theme of conquering nations coming in this. They don't talk about biblical times, or the Romans, the Babylonians, the Persians, and oh, by the way, they never do mention the Muslim conquering all of North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and getting all the way to the gates of Vienna, 1683, where they were finally turned back. The Battle of Tours in France was the high water mark of the Muslims back in the 7th century. Talk about economic opportunity. Overall industrialization is portrayed as bad. Yep. There's no mention of that a rising tide lifts all boats, or the fact that we have the highest standard of living in the world for a reason, and that other countries have been catching up with us for a reason. They use value terms like huge profits without corresponding huge risks or huge losses or bankruptcy. And they kind of leave out one of the quotes that I kind of like, and that is that Ben Franklin once said, "I'm all for doing good to the poor, but I differ in opinion about the means. I think the best way of doing good to the poor is not making them easy in poverty, but leading or driving them out of it." Oh, economics in the Roaring '20s. No mention, by the way, of the recession of 1920 or what the government did to overcome it. Oh, by the way, they did nothing. In fact, they cut back on expenses and reduced the national budget. In fact, tax cuts that Harding and Coolidge enacted paid off a third of the entire national debt in 5 years. That would be the modern equivalent of a $5 trillion reduction in our national debt. Now, economists still argue over the reasons for the Great Depression, but very, very few of them, and all of them that were touted unequal distribution of income as a cause of the Great Depression. All of them are socialists. I mean, they don't believe in free markets, which I refer to as socialists. In fact, the book doesn't look at the timeline of Smoot-Hawley, which was the tariff that ensured that the crash of '29 would result in a depression. They never, there is an awful lot of historical documentation, historical evidence that Smoot-Hawley and the stock market went the same way. When the fortunes of Smoot-Hawley were high, the stock market was going like this. When it thought that Smoot-Hawley might be turned around, the stock market climbed out. When it was signed, it just, the stock market then was dead for the next, well, it did climb and fall, but it ensured that we'd be in a trade war with the rest of the world, which meant that everybody lost. Next. FDR and the Great Depression. Oh boy. Now the book idolizes FDR as restoring confidence in the system. Glass-Steagall, which I think actually did make some sense, did get banks out of the speculation business, which stabilized the currency. But probably the smartest thing he did is he closed the gold window and stopped the monetary supply from contracting. On the other hand, the other New Deal policies like the minimum wage and restriction on production, especially in the farm sector, were counterproductive and did nothing to help us out of the Depression. Yes, FDR did restore confidence, but primarily because he took us off the gold standard, which was flowing out of the banks because no one else was on the gold standard and everybody could buy gold for a set price. When he did that, by the way, the banks immediately stabilized, and oh, by the way, that had nothing to do with the FDIC, which didn't exist. A historian by the name of Steve DiCanio showed that, and I think conclusively, that all of the failures of businesses to rehire after 1934 were due to this new thing called the minimum wage. And indeed, that book is a devastating critique of FDR's labor policies. Another historian by the name of Bert Folsom showed that FDR used the New Deal to reward pals and punish enemies. That's sort of what we call today crony capitalism, and if you believe that the failure to learn history means you're doomed to repeat it, you may see some evidence of that today. They didn't really talk about the New Deal as the solution, because there was no solution. In fact, if you look at the slide, we're still at 14.6% unemployment in 1940, and we're basically gearing up at that point for World War II. So did he solve it? No. But does this book tell us? Yes. Next slide. The next theme is science and technology. I'm trying to keep track of time. Now I should think that winning wars and keeping Americans and the world free would be good results, not dreaded results. It's not what first paragraph under science and technology talks about. The military is the source of S&T with usual dreaded results. Give you that as examples. What the book ignores, Eli Whitney, Fulton, Alexander Graham Bell, Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, and the Wright brothers. More locally, the book never mentions a fellow by the name of Charles Kettering. All the major breakthroughs, by the way, whether you're talking automobiles, steamboats, airplanes, PCs, or iPods, not only came from the private sector without government subsidies, but none came from the industry leader in that field. It was Ford, not Wells Fargo, that developed a usable transportation system called the auto. John Fitch, invented the steamboat, actually had it patented, but it was got in Fulton that made it a commercial success. It was the Wright brothers, not the balloon makers, that gave us the airplane. And let's see. Oh, Steve Jobs. It was not IBM, but Steve Jobs that gave us the PC, and Apple, not Sony, that created the next generation of music platform. So I'm constantly amazed, by the way. This book always talks about the glass being no better than half full, or half empty rather. And they're constantly, whereas the glass, in my opinion, is more full in America than any place else on the face of this earth. Next slide. This is where I'm in trouble. Women and political power. My belief is that the family is the foundation of society and has been for about 5,000 years or more. Wouldn't you want this book to address the impact of the search for women's political power on the family, whether it be divorce rates, poverty, broken homes? The book ignores any downside of the pill, liberalism. In fact, there is no real thought given to the individual, family, or societal consequences. I kind of want to, you have to ask yourself the question, what use is freedom if you're ignorant and destitute? The late Senator Patrick Daniel Moynihan, who was a Democrat, by the way, back in the 60s, said that it was a disaster that the African American community had a 30% illegitimacy rate. 30%. Today, that is the white illegitimacy rate, and the rate for blacks is over 70%. But do they discuss this in this book? Nope. Nor is there a mention of the new welfare plantation that's been created under the guise of the war on poverty and great society. From the projects to Planned Parenthood to daycare to failed inner city schools. On the other hand, if you really believe that the elite should run the world, then is it really an unintended consequence to create a huge dependency on government? Oh, by the way, as an aside, on page 861 of this book, they refer to Senator Hillary, or Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, as a skilled lawyer, not mentioning the fact that she actually flunked the DC bar exam. Immigration. Next slide, please, dear. Yes, why did so many come to the U.S. when Canada and Mexico are about the same distance away? That question, by the way, never comes up and is never answered. I will tell you that almost all of them came from places where life, liberty, and property were determined by the king, the dictator, or the chief. Freedom from oppression, freedom to make economic choices, freedom from want. This was, when they came here, there was no secret police, there was no conscription, there were no church tithes. Taxes were low until the progressives invented big government, big taxes. When you talk about the melting pot, and they sort of refer to it, but they really don't tell you what it's all about or what we're trying to do. We're trying to teach people that the American way really does lead them to economic and therefore all other kinds of freedom. Because without economic freedom, any other freedom you have doesn't matter. If you don't have freedom of property, freedom of life, if you don't have freedom to do what you want to do, you have no freedom, no matter how much money you won't have. So when it comes to, they never really talk about American exceptionalism, and you would, yeah, I guess so. Why wouldn't you want our children to learn the American way so that they won't be tempted to vote themselves bred in circuses, which is an old Roman thing. Again, no concern for the rationale for any opposition position to anything they say. Next slide. States' rights. They do a very mediocre job, in my opinion, talking about how the country, why there was such a long struggle over the rights of the states versus the rights of the federal government. They do talk about compromise and shifting power from states to feds, but without reiterating that powers not enumerated were left to the states and the people. That, by the way, is from the Constitution. There's no discussion of the concept of limited government as it was enumerated by our founding fathers. They do talk a little bit about nullification, but the real thing was, what rights do the states have if they object to what the feds are doing? They don't talk about the fact that it was high tariffs. It was the fact that the northern states had more political power, and they used high tariffs, which are taxes, to ensure that their industries in the Northeast could grow. But they did so at the expense of the South, and they impoverished the South. And that was one, but not the only, certainly, basis for the Civil War.
Tom?
Yes?
We have 10 minutes before the session is over with. If you want to do any questions and answers, you're
okay.
Otherwise, just keep going.
Okay. They talk about the Civil War settled the ability of states to secede. By the way, that was an open discussion when the Constitution was ratified. And of course, the 17th Amendment, I'll talk about that a little bit more later. The argument in the book was that the states were corrupt. The 17th Amendment gave the power to the people. What it really did is they concentrated the power in Washington. So the lobbyists didn't have to be in 50 states, they could be in one District of Columbia. That's the result, unintended or intended. That's voting rights. Originally, by the way, they really intended only property owners were going to have the ability to vote. And that was because they're the ones with skin in the game. This was gradually extended to all white people, and then all black men, regardless of race or color, and then to women, and then finally to the youngsters. But this is taught as a class warfare issue, when in every case, it was, they never really talk about the, why it was that property owners wanted the right to determine the use of their own property. Because taxes are nothing more than a confiscation of property from one person to give to something else. And in today's society, most of that goes to some other person. You can say that that's buying votes, or it's altruistically to provide a safety net. But the bottom line is that basically the way that republics have gone throughout the course of history is they've gone from republics to democracies, from democracies to mobocracies, because when people figure out they can vote themselves bread and circuses, they find politicians that will vote that way. From mobocracies to disaster, from disaster to dictatorship. Be an interesting discussion where we are today. So, essentially all the voting rights, that's okay, leave it where it is, took power from those who pay to those who receive without thought as to what that means for a republic. Civil rights. Civil rights, by the way, as discussed in the Constitution, was a very radical idea in 1776, and is still so in most of the world today. So the book does continue, it describes the U.S. as a democracy, by the way, not a republic. I just want to remind people that democracy is two wolves and a lamb deciding on lunch. Next slide. I just want to I'd like to get at least a question or two. The rise of the progressive. This is kind of a ties together. Populism, which, in populism, progressivism, whatever you want to call it, starts in about 1870. It's sort of an outgrowth of Marxism, or Marx's writings, Das Kapital. Throughout the book, populism, progressivism is taught as a class warfare issue. The book singles out Andrew Carnegie for not paying income tax, despite the fact that there was no income tax. And indeed, what it fails to mention is that of the $450 million or dollars or so that he made throughout his life, he donated to charities, to public structures, $400 million. But he did it of his own accord. He did it of free will. He did it because he believed that that's what you do when God gives you great gifts. He actually decided that he was going to give $300 million of his wealth before he had made his first million. They talk about, they ill-define socialism, they should call it fascism. By the way, progressivism, socialism, communism, fascism are all the same thing, just in varying degrees of badness. They all depend upon two fundamental precepts. One is the labor theory of value. The other is the perfectibility of man. If you believe in those two concepts, you'll believe anything, especially if you study history. You can't believe in that and study history properly. Next slide. Global war on terror. They talk about, they never really talk about the fact that Osama bin Laden was an Islamist, a jihadist. They never identify Al-Qaeda as an Islamist jihadist group. No mention of links between Islam and terrorism or terrorist groups. And kind of finally, if you don't think the DHS will help an administration to fundamentally transform America, you have to ask yourself this: why did they order 1.6 billion rounds of ammunition? Who the heck are they shooting at? Next, summarizing. I believe it really is up to the parents and the school board to ensure their children are informed about who the founding fathers were, what they believed and fought for, and why we believe in American exceptionalism. And by the way, I want to thank the state for recognizing that we ought to add that to our syllabus and curriculum. This book, by the way, does not help any of that. if this generation grows up to believe that there is no God, that all cultures and beliefs are equal, that mankind is perfectible, then we will go the way of every other republic that has ever been constituted. As I said in the beginning, the ill-informed are more susceptible to emotional arguments. Significance of this information in our society today. Most people understand Marxism as a class struggle with a proletariat rise against the bourgeois and then institute of workers' paradise. First of all, men who are believers know that man cannot create a perfect utopia on earth because we are imperfect and imperfectible. But through the destruction of God and his morality, the concept of being a born sinner is also gone. What replaces it is moral and cultural relativism, where all morals of all cultures are created equal. The proper study of history should be enough to disabuse anyone of that belief. And the study of what our founding fathers really built and why should provide all that is necessary to put the U.S. back on a system of private property rights with Christian principles for a better society. That's what I have. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
How long has this book been used?
Well, it's copyright 2007, so it's been in use now for about 6 years.
Is that the first time it had been copyrighted?
As far yes, the problem is that it's not the only one. In fact, it's probably not one of the most leftist. If you get there are history books by written by Howard Zinn that are far to the left of this, and there are other. Just ma'am.
So, if you had a student or a kid who was using one of these books at school, what kind of things would you do at home?
What can parents do?
Okay,
I'll repeat. What you asked was, if you have this book in the classroom, what can parents do? And I think the biggest thing is to know at home. There are two ways. Basically, there's an internal and an external strategy tactic. Internally, I think that you really have to ensure that the students, and we did this around the kitchen table at dinner, because my mom and dad are kind of big on America. But mom also got involved in curriculum. She actually went to the principal and argued that and got things changed.
Back then?
Back then. That was back in the 50s and 60s. My mom was, she give her an inch, she'd be 4'10". But she was pretty feisty. And she didn't like what was being taught and how it was being taught.
Because it was much better back then.
I know it was. That's what's scary. It's a harder fight today because my belief is, and I'm at fault as much as anybody else, we just kind of let things go. We didn't pay attention. Yes, Kelly. Yes.
So you just take one more and then it's time to go.
There's a lot of textbook consolidation, so there aren't that many publishers. If you made the observation that apparently adoption of that book was a mistake, that the board had failed in its fiduciary duties, and that you wanted the publisher to provide errata and corrections and admit to some strategic omissions, and that as a district you wouldn't be adopting any more textbooks from that publisher in the future until they came up.
Yeah. And quite honestly,
it's a future conversation, right?
Right. And I'm having that conversation with our superintendent and director of curriculum.
Yeah.
So our big problem right now is we have so many other things that we have to do, thanks to the federal government and our state government, that we have no money for additional textbooks. I want to thank Joe. Joe, I don't mean to beat on you, and I'm trying not to.
It's a quick letter.
There's so much fun doing
It's a quick letter to try to get a response from public.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I have been told and know this to be a fact that there's some districts that aren't even allowing this book to go home.
They're not allowed to take it home.
Can't take it home because they don't want parents to see it.
Parents don't want to
They don't, the parents.
Michael, there's a lot of schools that don't let children take their books home because they don't come back to school.
Yeah, well, how can a parent check it if it's not allowed to come home?
Well, but I'll say that part of the problem we have today is because parents will not look at the books that their children bring home. It is our fault that we've allowed it to get to where we have allowed it to where it is today. And if your children don't bring a book home, do what Michael did, and go to the school and demand, I want to see the books my children are being taught from. Parents are the reason.
Parents are the front line.
But
They're the
but
first line.
parents don't know what they don't know.
Right, you look
So
at
we gotta go tell them.
Only they